foreign, predatory, parasitic corporations are replacing our natural environment with an industrial landscape of wind turbines. One Nation will stand against sending children down a path of drug dependency and body mutilation to appease the gender cult. Leave our kids alone. The Trusted Digital Identity Bill is a global surveillance and control mechanism that profit-hungry corporations and power-mad politicians drafted and crafted. One Nation opposes this inhuman, dystopian future that the United Nations promotes as the Great Reset, and we condemn this Parliament for signing on to it. I called for Australia to reject the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and instead mount a great resist. Just like the koalas being euthanized to make way for wind turbines, or damaged solar panels leaking toxic heavy metals into waterways, the United Nations net zero plan again involves killing the environment to save it. I've been speaking about the fear, the oppression and the inhuman cruelty of our COVID response since July 2020. I promised to hound down those responsible, and I will continue relentlessly to keep that promise. You're about to be live with me, Senator Malcolm Roberts.
Well, good day. It's not Senator Malcolm Roberts. Bit of a surprise. It's Craig Kelly, the National Director of One Nation Party, filling in for Malcolm today. Malcolm's having the day off, and he's given me the job to fill in for him and just go through what a big week in politics it's been. But firstly, we've got these rallies, national rallies coming up this weekend, this Sunday. 11 a.m, every capital city except for Sydney, which starts at 12 noon. I know in Brisbane up there, 11 a.m. at King George's Square. In Sydney, we're actually opposite the Art Gallery, a little bit unusual place. Speaker's Corner opposite the Art Gallery. A great spot to have a rally. Now, what we're going to be talking about at these rallies is two issues. Firstly, the National ID Bill, that Digital Identity Bill. Gone through the Senate, hasn't yet gone through the House of Representatives. We're going to send a real loud message to Mr. Albanese that the public, the Australian public, does not want this National ID Bill going through. The second one, of course, the rally is the issue on free speech. Look, we've seen everything heading backwards in the terms of free speech in this country. We've seen this missing disinformation bill being floated. Originally, remember, a Liberal Party idea, are now being pushed through by the Labor government. We've seen the disaster of the E-Safety Commissioner, just a bureaucrat down there in Canberra, completely, utterly out of control, trying to censor the internet, not only in Australia but worldwide. So we've got a great lineup of speakers. I know Senator Roberts is leading the speakers up there in Brisbane, starting at 11 o'clock. And down in Sydney, we've got a great line of speakers, some real special guests coming through, which we'll be announcing early tomorrow morning, but 12 noon in Sydney. Also, if you're in Sydney, it looks like we're in for a pretty wet old weekend. So bring your umbrella, but we'll be on rain, hail, or shine. So also, while we're doing this, also I understand that any questions you've got on any current political issues or any discussion points, just send them through on the links below, and we'll have a bit of a discussion on those as well. Now, one of the real issues that concerned me this week was the conduct of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that we also call the ABS. That's the little acronym that they have. One of those alphabet agencies down in Canberra. Now, every month, the ABS is putting out data for excess deaths, and they've been doing that for several years. And over the last couple of years, we've seen really concerning data coming out every month, showing double-digit excess mortality in Australia. So the excess mortality is basically, it measures the number of people that pass away in Australia in one particular month, and it compares it against the baseline. And that baseline moves over time. Generally, it's the previous 4 years, an average of the previous 4 years. And that showed up, as we said, that was almost where we were losing, I think it was like 20, 30,000 people a year, which just coincidentally lined up with the COVID vaccine rollout program. Now, these deaths, this should be the number one issue in the country. When we've got thousands of people more dying every month than what we would expect to be. And there's no one can actually put their finger on exactly what it is, although the most likely culprit is likely to be, more than likely to be, those COVID vaccines. That's the most likely culprit we know. But this should be the number one issue in the country today. And yet we can hardly get a single media entity anywhere in the country to raise anything about this whatsoever. Now, we know that Senator Babbitt has worked with Malcolm and Pauline in the Senate, and they've successfully got an inquiry up into excess mortality into this country. And that's great work by those senators to put that together. That should hopefully shed a bit more light on it. But the concern that I've got is this data which we rely upon from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, that every month that they've been putting it out. Now, what they did for January's data, they've simply changed the methodology that enables them to hide the excess death data in this country. It is just absolutely outrageous what they have done. Now, normally, as I said, you would compare the month of January 2024, which is the last data that they've published. I think we had something like 14,000 deaths in that month of January across Australia. And they would compare that against the baseline average, and then you would work out what your excess mortality is, whether that 14,000 is up, down, below, whether it's a concern or where it stands. Now, what the ABS have done, as I said, normally they would always compare it against a baseline of the previous 4 years. That's simply the international standard that is used. You don't just use one single year's worth of data. But what the ABS are doing now, and they have done in this most recent report, they've compared the excess deaths with 2023. So they've given us the excess deaths for January 2024 and put as their headline, they're comparable with 2023. In other words, nothing to see here, move on, don't worry, there's nothing to be concerned about. But when you look back to what the excess deaths were in 2023, which they don't mention, you've got to go back and go through their old reports. In January of 2023, we had excess deaths in this country running at over 12%. So we had close to 2,000 extra people in January 23 die than we normally would be expected. And that should be the headline for January 2024. We still have excess deaths in this country on the latest ABS data in double digits, and yet the ABS don't even report that number now. They're hiding that number, and they're reporting it against just 2023 to downplay what should be, I said, the number one issue of concern in this nation. Look, we expect groups like the ABC to put spin and put misinformation out. We've seen the conduct of the likes of the TGA over the recent couple of years. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics was meant to be that one organisation that Australians could trust, that would put the data out without fear nor favour, that would put the data out every single month for excess deaths and give us what the true indication is. But now we've got the Australian Bureau of Statistics putting spin on the data, hiding inconvenient truths. It is really a very sad day for the many people that have worked at what has been a great institution, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, for many, many decades, to now have it collapse into a state where they are actually fudging the data and hiding it from the Australian public. It is really something that is outrageous. I hope the Senate, during the inquiry, that Senator Hanson, Senator Roberts and Senator Babbitt can really get in there, and actually with some good of maybe one or two of the good Liberal senators that are still left there. Senator Rennick might put his toe in the water in this as well, and just be outraged at what the Australian Bureau of Statistics has done, because it is simply not good enough. It's a disgrace. Because we talk about other things in our community where there's deaths occurring, a handful there and a handful there, and every single death is a tragedy. But just to think that we've got thousands of excess deaths every month, and it's not even getting reported on the news, and now you've got the ABS hiding the data. Really, it's really a shocking state of affairs. Now, the other interesting piece of data that came through this week was retail sales for the month of March. Now, that's a pretty good indicator of how the economy is going. Is retail sales up or down? Are consumers tightening their wallets, or are they opening their wallets and spending? Now, just have to remember, for the month of March, in February, we had record migration. We had an extra 105,000 people, net migration, come into this country in February alone. That was a record, the first time ever we've had over 100,000 people in one single month. In fact, if you look at the long-term statistics on migration rates into Australia, between the end of the Second World War and the Sydney Olympics, the year 2000, the average migration that we had into this country every year was around 80,000, just over 80,000 net new migrants coming into this country every year. But yet under Albanese, in 1 month alone, we've had over 105,000. So you've had all those extra consumers come into the country, needing to buy food, clothing, furniture. You think that would have kicked up the retail sales. And not to mention you've had the inflation. So the inflation also should have substantially kicked up retail sales. But what actually happened in that data? If you look at it, retail sales in the month of March actually fell. They went backwards. They were backwards 0.4%. So this is a catastrophic, very frightening economic indicator going forward, that you could have all those extra people come into the country. You'd have inflation running at 3% plus 4% for the year, and yet retail sales went backwards when they had all those things to the advantage, when the numbers you would expect to would have increased. There must be so many small businesses out there, so many small retailers doing it really, really tough at the moment, seeing their sales go backwards as their rents go up. These retailers have their rents adjusted to CPI, so their sales are going backwards, but their rents are going up, their electricity costs are going up, every other cost they would have is going up through the roof. And yet, when it comes to the one thing that they need to increase, hopefully it's the sales, we see those sales going backwards. And is it any wonder that sales are going backwards? Just look at some of the other economic data that we've got coming out at the moment. Unbelievably, I say it's unbelievably, out of all the countries in the OECD, have a guess which country had the biggest increase from 2022 to 2023. So last year, the biggest increase in personal income tax in the world. You guessed it, Australia. We had a incredibly, in 1 year, personal income tax in this country increased 7.6%. An extraordinary number. First in the world, and not just first, but first by a country mile. The next worst performer was our friends across the Tasman, New Zealand, at 4.5%. If you take away Australia and New Zealand, most of the other countries were in a narrow band of either about a 2% increase or a 2% decrease in the rate of personal income tax that people are paying. So 7.6% is the reason is because of bracket creep in our country is as you get more in salary and inflation adjusted increase in your salary, it pushes you into the higher tax bracket and you pay more tax. And that's what we've seen the Albanese government rely upon. The inflation's beautiful for them, pushes people up into higher tax brackets and they get more taxation revenue in the door. 7.6% increase in tax in 1 year. And we'll have the budget coming up next week where Mr. Albanese will be so generous and say, I'm going to give some of this back to you. He's going to reduce everyone's taxes. But all he is doing, that we can't fall for this nonsense from Albanese. All he is actually going to do is give back a small fraction of the extra tax that he has taken. Let's hope the people are awake to this. Let's hope the media are awake to it. It was good to see that, get a little bit of publicity through the week, but just extraordinary that we could be one of the worst performers in the world. And then the other concerning statistic, these are again OECD official numbers, was that our real disposable incomes were also fell almost as further than anywhere else in the world. So real disposable income, it's what your income is. It measures the increase that you've had in your salary, less the inflationary effect that has it. So I think the Australian numbers were something like a 4% increase in salary, but inflation for that period of time was something like 5.3%. So we have inflation in this country running faster than wage increases. So what happens? That simply means the people are less well off. And again, we were one of the worst performing nations in the world. Most other countries were, wages and inflation were going par to par. Some of them, wages were increasing faster than inflation. But in Australia, we have inflation running faster than wages, and that simply means your real wage falls. So you're actually getting less to start with when your real wage falls. You got the government then taking more of it. And if you've got a mortgage, because the cost of mortgages don't show up in the CPI numbers, if you've got a mortgage, we've also had Australian mortgage holders have had some of the biggest increases in the world. And the reason for that is most Australian mortgages are on a variable rate, which is a little bit unique compared to the ground. Well, we have more mortgages on a variable rate, so the rate changes over time, as compared to a fixed rate, which is more common in other countries. So because we have that greater proportion of mortgages with a variable rate, we have more people being affected as the rates go up. So we've had mortgage repayments in this country, again, have been one of the highest in the world. So you put those three things together, and is it any wonder that retail sales are falling? So it'd be good to hear from anyone out there with a small retail business, a small retail shop, how you're experiencing things, what are you seeing, what's happening in your business on the ground. Your sales going backwards, are they holding, are they increasing? So anyone out there, we'd love to hear from you about how your retail sales are going, and even just consumers themselves. Are you finding you're cutting back on your monthly spending? Are you cutting back on your discretionary purchases, whether they be clothing or footwear or jewelry? Are you cutting back on those things? Let's hear from you on the line here, and send the message in, and we'll see we get some questions up on those issues. The other concern that we've also had, there's some data that came out, was what's happening in our public hospitals. And what would you expect when Albanese and the Labor government are bringing in hundreds of thousands of more people into this country? It's not just the housing that we are not building to keep up with it. There's also our hospital systems that we're not keeping up with the increase in the population base. So we've seen almost every parameter that you could imagine, from hospital waiting times to the length of the number of people that get seen within a 4-hour period in emergency centres. Everything that we can measure shows our hospital performances is falling, and you're being pushed further and further to the back of the queue. And this is not something you can fix quickly. To build new hospitals is a long-term prospect. We've still got many people in the medical field still mandated out of their work because they decided to exercise their free right and not to inject any of those experimental medical interventions. So is it any wonder our hospital queues are blowing out? And that is something that really doesn't show up in any economic data, but just shows that your quality of life is going backwards. We've seen over the last couple of years how access to bulk billing has fallen. Many people may have, I know many doctors around the country have changed. It used to be bulk billing doctors are no longer bulk billing doctors. We've seen a big fall in the percentage, even though it's picked up a couple of percent in the last couple of months. But since Albanese has taken over the reins, it's fallen significantly, with fewer and fewer doctors actually bulk billing, and more people having to pay, cough out of their pocket $100 just to go to the doctors. I can remember when Tony Abbott proposed a joint co-payment of $5. You would have thought the world was going to end when he suggested that. Well, people are now paying 20 times more of that co-payment just to go and see a doctor. Because this is what happens when things get out of control, when government expenditure gets out of control. The rate of people coming to this country that Albanese has is completely and utterly unsustainable. Another great cartoon today from Pauline Hanson. You have seen that today, hopefully talking about those rates of migration and why Albanese is actually addicted to it. And the simple reason is because the economy is going backwards so quickly. Real GDP per capita is falling. We're in a recession. So remember, you've got GDP, which is the overall size of the economy, which measures all the goods and services produced. And then you've got GDP per capita, which is the average size of each person's slice. So if you want to grow the economy, an ex-Papua New Guinea or a few islands over there in Indonesia, that will make the Australian economy bigger. But the real test, and what's important to the average citizen, is your slice of the pie. If you grow the economy, if you grow the GDP and you bring in more people into the country, you've got to cut that slice of the pie up into more pieces. And are those pieces smaller? And that's what is happening. GDP per capita has fallen for the last 3 quarters. So we are actually in a GDP per capita recession in this country. The media never talks about it because it's always measuring a recession as just straight out GDP. They don't measure it, which they should, and per capita for each individual citizen's slice of the pie. It is really, really tough out there. You can see that we are, so the consumers themselves are actually experiencing a recession like standards. And it's only going to get worse because as we bring more and more people into them, many of them unskilled into the economy, that simply means yes, the overall pie gets bigger, but each individual person's size of the cake gets smaller. And that will probably happen again next time. And again, it's like a Ponzi scheme. That requires Albanese to import more and more people into the country. And to try and balance it out, to try and create sort of like, this is the idea of how he'll grow the economy by just keeping importing more and more and more people into the place. It really is, we really have got a mess. That is why at One Nation, our policy is very clear. We should have net zero migration into this country at least until we can fix up, and we can catch up with our infrastructure, we can catch up with our hospitals, and we can catch up with our housing. It is inconceivable that a government would import more people into the country without having the housing built for them or the ability to build those housing. And a 2.5% population growth is what we have because of our the high level of migration into this country. You simply can't keep up the housing at 2.5%. 2.5% is what you would normally see in some third world African country where their population rates were out of control. But this is what we have in Australia. We have the ability to control it. We don't have to have these rates. We can set the number of people that are able to migrate to this country. But it's simply being done to prop up the appalling economic performance that we've seen from our dear old friends, Mr. Albanese. Because the other one that's been a great concern, I think, to everyone has been electricity costs. And they continue to go up. Now, we've seen there in Queensland a great election stunt. What's his name? What's his nickname up there? What do you Queenslanders call him? Miles out of his depth. That's exactly right. And I can remember when Mr. Albanese was talking about him and said, "Oh, Stephen Miles, he's a real Labor champion. He's going to win this next election." I thought, mate, you've just put the kiss of death on him. He's got no hope now that he's been endorsed by Anthony Albanese. But look, that $1,000 that everyone's getting up there in Queensland, it's all smoke and mirrors. The money's got to come from somewhere. That just simply means it's less services somewhere else, or higher taxes that you were paying. It's just smoke and mirrors. Why not just get on and build our coal-fired power stations that we do? Keep the coal-fired power stations that we have going. Don't close any more down in this nation. And let's try and get electricity prices back to some competitive level. It is just, if you make some international comparisons between what Australians are paying and what they pay in Canada and America, we are paying 2, 3, and up to 4 times more for electricity in this country than they are in the USA. So how can an Australian business, forget the consumers for the moment, how can Australian businesses compete where they need a lot of electricity, they need a lot of energy? How can they compete when they're paying 3 to 4 times more what is happening in the US? This simply just means our factories and industries are simply going to close down one after the other. We've seen that. You lost in Queensland there what was the EV charging stations. The group that did the EV charging stations up there. Tritium, again, one of Mr. Albanese's favourite picks. And this was the manufacturing of the future for Australia. Well, these guys, before they actually had to basically go belly up and appoint administrators, the last thing they did to try and save the company was close down their manufacturing facility there in Brisbane and move it off to Tennessee. And why Tennessee? Well, electricity costs are half of what they were paying in Brisbane. So is any wonder that they tried to move their manufacturing out, close everything down, and they managed to burn through $2 billion worth of capital. That's what this company floated for. When they floated on the stock exchange, US $2 billion. I think they're now worth a couple of cents. Their shares are worth a couple of cents each, and the company virtually has. Once the administrators get in there and take their share, there'll be very left for any of the shareholders. Unfortunately, this is what's happening in manufacturing that we see here in Australia. It's a tough international competitive field out there. It really is. And how Australian businesses have got to be able to compete. That's why we're a wealthy nation, because it's not because government legislates that makes us wealthy compared to international standards. It's because we've got the ability in this nation to produce things and do certain things better than they do in other places of the world. It's our coal mining, our iron ore mining, our beef. Those industries are our leading industries that we have a competitive advantage in. And because the competitive advantage is big enough, that makes us a wealthy country. But one of our competitive advantages also used to be electricity costs. We used to have electricity costs in this country lower than what they were in the USA. You go back to the 1970s and 1980s, we had electricity costs lower in this country than what they were in the USA. And now we're paying 2, 3, and if you compare the basket case of South Australia with some US states, up to 4 times higher cost for their electricity prices. It just destroys our economic competitiveness. Not only does it smash consumers, and this is unfortunately what is happening time and time again, because we have this madness, this delusion that we hear all the time about how these renewables are cheaper. Well, which state in Australia, let's do a bit of a quiz here. Which state in Australia has the highest percentage of renewables in their grid? The answer, South Australia. And here's another. So which state in Australia has the nation's highest electricity prices? You don't have to be too smart to work that out. South Australia. It's the same in the USA. Which state is there the one that loves all their solar and wind power and always pushing renewables? That's California over there, boasting recently about how they've got all these new big batteries in the grid and how wonderful is all these solar panels coming online. Well, data out from the I think it's the American Energy Institute. I think the February data showed that California had moved into first place of the highest electricity prices in the US out of all the 50 states, sorry, the 49 states, except with the one exception, of course, is Hawaii, which is the island state which has to import everything and basically has to import the oil to run. But of all the mainland states, it is California in the US that now holds the place as number one for high electricity costs. And look at what that is doing to the Californian economy. Look at the social mess that we are seeing in California at the moment. I know many of the trips that I've made to San Francisco, I always used to like to go down to Union Square. There was always a bustling, vibrant place, a lot of great retail stores around it. You could get a cup of coffee and sit and watch people coming and going, and you know, a bit of excitement sort of thing down there where the trams start from down there in Union Square. Well, recently we've seen video from there where almost every single retail shop in that area is closed down. The place is now a ghost town with all the retail shops simply closing down, and the economy of California in such an absolute mess. People leaving the state in droves. Why? Because they're following this madness, this absolutely madness of thinking that you can save the world with solar and wind power. It is craziness. And that, unfortunately, is exactly what we are trying to do here in Australia. It is this grand experiment. Nowhere in the world, there's nowhere in the world that is trying to run their grid almost exclusively on solar, wind, and backed up with big batteries. And yet that is our net zero plan here in Australia. You know, look, anyone with half a brain knows can see the intermittency of the wind and solar, that the batteries that you would have to back it up. Remember, you have to recharge your batteries. So even if you've got batteries to last you and get you through one windless night, what happens if the next day it's overcast with no wind? How are you going to keep that? You need to have multiple lots of batteries to keep it up, which is just, you know, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cost, which will just make Australia, it is completely involved. We are trying to do something that has never been done before, and no one else in the world is trying to do it. And we see these. There was a great headline the other day talking about all these countries that were supposedly 100% renewable, and this was the future. When you looked at who these countries were, it was places like Bhutan and Nepal and the tiny economy of Iceland, where they've got geothermal. But all these other countries, their electricity grids were almost 100% hydroelectricity because they've got the mountain ranges, they've got the regular rainfall and the snow, that they can run the hydroelectricity. We don't have the topography, and so there's a good comment, Mr. When the lights go out, go and knock on Elbo's door. I don't know what you'll need some candles when the lights go, because it's just a matter of time. I think, look, if I wasn't with One Nation, I think the job that you could go and work out in Australia is selling diesel generators around the place, because we're going to need them. The way we are heading and closing down our coal-fired power stations, it is sure as night follows day that we will have blackouts coming in this country. So everyone should like to have a stock at home of some torches, some extra batteries for your torches, a set of candles, matches, because you're going to need them. You're going to need them with the policies that both the Labor and the Liberal Party are doing. And it is also, the Liberals just can't say, oh, this is all Labor's fault. Now, when I was a member of the Liberal Party, one of the things that we did, remember, we won I first stood in 2010, and between 2010 and 2013, when Tony Abbott won that 2013 election in an absolute landslide, we were marching in the streets against the carbon tax. That was the sentiment on the streets. Australians did not want any carbon tax. We marched in the streets, and Tony Abbott had such a big landslide win that in the Parliament, if you see the Parliament on TV, it's the government members sit to the right of the Speaker and the opposition sit to the left. When Tony won in 2013, he had such a big win that we had people that were part of the government that actually had to go and sit on the other side, had to go and sit on the Labor Party side, because we had just so many people we won with. And that was fighting against the carbon tax. And yet somehow or other, during that term of government, Tony Abbott turned up in the party room one day, and so we've signed up to Paris. 26 to 28% emission reduction target. We've signed up. I'm going, I'll stand next to the guy. Said, hang on, how did this happen? What happened to the debate? Did I go out for a bathroom break and I missed the debate on these things? Is that actually what happened? Tony made, it was a decision made unilaterally, without any debate whatsoever in the party room, going 180 degrees of the policies that we took to the last election and won so comprehensively. And after, I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school here, but afterwards I asked Tony, this is after he'd lost the leadership, I said, mate, why did you sign up to Paris? Why did you agree to it? We didn't have to agree to it. Why did you do it for? And he said, Turnbull was on me, and Turnbull was pressuring me in cabinet, and Julie Bishop was telling me, Pine was telling me, and Brandis was telling me, and I was trying to run a cabinet where we sort of all got on and agreed with each other. And they all seem to want this Paris target, and that's how we ended up with it. And then, of course, that did brilliantly well. And if that then wasn't bad enough, when Scott Morrison won the election in 2019, we went to that election with a commitment that we were not going to support net zero. That was Liberal Party policy. Again, without any discussion in the party room, without any debate, the Liberal Prime Minister, this time was Scott Morrison, came into that party room and announced Australia had signed up to net zero by 2050. Again, without any single debate, without any idea how we're going to get there to this mythical net zero, without any consideration of the damage that it's going to do to the Australian economy. And see, people sometimes think that net zero, it's only about the electricity. Let's just put more solar panels in and we'll do it. Remember, the electricity sector is only about a third. If you look at your emissions profile, or I say emissions of CO2, that's that sparkling mineral water, the bubbles in that sparkling mineral water, what they're talking about. And of course also methane, which they counted as well. And the methane is the burps and farts of the cattle. So it's not just about putting solar panels in to get to net zero. You've got to transform your entire motor fleet, your car fleet and your trucking fleet to electric cars. Now this is anyone that's here from Sydney and Brisbane has driven on the Pacific Highway at Christmas time to see how many cars. Imagine if you had to get all those cars charged up on charging stations, how many charging stations you would need. It's just complete and utter pie in the sky, pigs might fly stuff. And you simply cannot have the charging infrastructure in this country without spending trillions of dollars to build the charging stations that are possibly needed to have every single car in this country electric. And then, of course, you've got the other part of the emission profile is the agriculture. It's about 13-14%. But again, if you look at people think, let's reduce the emissions from agriculture, and they think about, we've got to put the solar panels on the shed to run the machinery in the shed rather than have a diesel generator, or the tractor that goes out in the paddock will make that an electric tractor somehow to do it. Forget the weight and how these things are getting bogged in the field with how heavy they'd be as some of those big farming equipment, the batteries that they would have in them. But it's got nothing to do with that. To get your emissions down in agriculture, it is the burps and the farts of the cattle. And the only way you can truly do that is to cull the herds. You've got to go around and reduce your herd sizes. You think this is craziness? We're seeing this already over there in Europe. We're seeing in Ireland, they're talking about how many head of cattle they're going to have to cull their herds for to try and get to these interim targets that they've got set. That is what is required. This is the madness of it. And no one will sit down, none of these advocates that say, oh, we need to get to net zero, will sit down and actually spell it out exactly what is involved in the place. And yet, Liberals signed up to it. Labor have signed up to it. The only party pushing back on this is One Nation. And we've got to keep pushing back on it. And we've got to explain to the Australian people what this nonsense of net zero actually means and how much it will cost. And then a further question is, what will it reduce the level of CO2 in the atmosphere by? And then the ultimate question, by how much less bad weather will we get? Of course, the answer is like 0 and 0, but at a great expense to the Australian economy. Not only is it a great expense to us, pursuing this madness of net zero, I call it a reckless insanity or destructive insanity. Every single thing we do with net zero hands an economic, political, and military advantage to the communist Chinese. Just go through it and think about what it does, okay? Now, the communist Chinese are just laughing at us. They haven't agreed to net zero by 2050. They're saying they might do something by 2060. So they'll stop and they'll watch us destroy our economy and transfer all our wealth to China, and they might come and join in 2060. Like pigs might fly if that would happen, sort of thing. Just go through it. Firstly, cars. Who controls most of the electric car production in the world? It's China. They're the biggest EV manufacturers. Forget the Europeans and the Americans. It is the Chinese. Solar panels. We have all these subsidies, billions of dollars worth of subsidies for solar panels. Who benefits? The Chinese, because they have almost total dominance in the market for solar panels. The same for wind turbine parts. Where do all the wind turbine parts come from? China. So all we are doing is when we push up the costs of producing things in Australia, those factories close down and they move across to China. It's like this big sucking sound. We may as well be sending them container loads of Australian dollars packed up on pallets to them, because that is the madness that we are doing with this net zero. And we've got the Liberal Party. They are really playing games with this nuclear power argument they've got. Now, firstly, I agree that we should have nuclear power. When I was a member of Parliament, the member for Hughes, I was the only member of Parliament that had a nuclear reactor in his electorate. That reactor down there at Lucas Heights was one of our few nuclear reactors that we had. The only nuclear reactor we had in this country. It's a research reactor. It's not used for electricity generation. And just quickly, what country do you think we had to go to build that reactor? Who had the technology to do that? Right? It was Argentina. So what we should be doing is not rushing in and buying reactors from other countries. We should be putting the money into research and development. One of the great former heads of ANSTO down there at Lucas Heights, a guy called Ady Patterson, a genius in his field, kept on saying, we've got to invest more in education in the nuclear space. He wanted to set up a nuclear university where everything about nuclear we could learn and develop it. It's no point Australia just selling the uranium. We should be trying to own the technology as well and developing the technology. That's where, if we want to put government investment in, it should be going, not to try and build a solar panel factory like Chris Bowen want to do, to think that the waste and the stupidity to try and compete against China to set up a solar panel manufacturing facility in Australia is just beyond ridiculous. That money would have been far better spent into research and development into the nuclear power and what we can do, and setting up a full nuclear university. So it is the Liberals just playing games with this. Now, as I said, yes, we should remove those bans on nuclear power, But the reality is, by the time those bans were removed, by the time you're able to get them through a Senate, and it's unlikely you'll get them through the next Senate, it would be the Parliament after would be your earliest, and you found a location where you could build a nuclear reactor, and you could get through all the court cases that you would need and all the environmental approvals. Right? The reality is it would be at least a decade. It would at least be 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, until we could have a nuclear power station up and running in this country from today. Now, the problem is we don't have that period of time to allow without coal-fired power stations closing down. So that's why we should be investing in maintaining our existing coal-fired power stations. And if they need to close, we should be planning to replace like for like. You often hear, oh, we're replacing coal-fired power stations with big batteries. Absolute, unmitigated nonsense that is. Complete nonsense when you look at the numbers and the data. And you have to know that a coal-fired power station can churn out the electricity 24/7. And the big battery goes for an hour or so, then runs out and needs recharging. You've got to wait until you get more excess supplies of electricity in the grid to recharge it. Right, so the Liberal Party, instead of saying what needs to be said, right, they are using this nuclear power as an excuse to say what really needs to be said, that we need to be investing in coal-fired power stations in this country to get us through the period of the next 15 to 20 years. And then after that, by all means, let's look at where nuclear power takes us to. But just to say, yes, we're going to do nuclear power as an excuse not to talk about coal, which is what the Liberal Party are doing, is really, it's just typical what we're seeing at the Liberal Party. We've seen a similar thing again with Liberal Party policy to people can use their superannuation to buy housing. Now, firstly, I think that's actually a policy by itself that I agree with. Remember, super is your money, and you can use your super at 65 to go and buy yourself a house. So why couldn't you use some of your super when you're younger to get yourself when you actually need a place and get your foothold in the market? Because if you haven't got the best way to keep people out of poverty in their old age is to ensure that they own their own home when they go into retirement. And we're making it harder and harder for young people to get into housing. But without the real issue in housing in this country is not the supply side. It is the demand side. To have these record number of people migrating into the nation where you cannot supply it, that is what has to be done. You have to stand up and you have to say, we need to fix migration in this country. We need to cut the migration numbers back. We need to have it for a period net zero migration. That's what the Liberal Party should be saying. But no, again, too weak, too gutless. And all they can say, again, look, let's come up with another sort of half-hearted policy about allowing people to use their super for housing without really addressing what is the true problem with the housing issues in this country. And that is simply too many people being imported into the nation. That's the problem. And that's the problem we have to fix, we have to address. Again, which party's doing the hard work? Which party's doing the hard yards? It's One Nation. And we'll keep doing it, and we'll keep talking about it up to the next election. And hopefully we'll have some common sense from these major parties. But it's just a tragedy that you've got to have just a couple of senators from One Nation, and with Ralph Babbitt down there as well thrown in, the only people prepared to talk about this and be strong enough to talk about it, because it's both the other parties are affected by this woke mind virus that you can't even talk about rates of migration because you might be labelled as a racist, a terrible racist. That's what they want to try and do it. We've got to overcome this in our nation, and we've got to be able to say, look, the people that are harmed the most by these high rates of migration are the people that have migrated to the country in recent years. They are the ones that are most affected by it. They are the ones doing it the toughest. They're the people that would benefit the most from a cutback in these high rates of migration. It's got nothing to do with what country does the people come from. It is simply a matter of numbers. And we've got to push back on this. Otherwise, we're going to see the continuation of the destruction of the Australian dream, where young people will simply just give up altogether on it. So look, we're coming close up to the hour. There's been a few good comments coming through. What's this one here? Australia desperately, from Kate. Australia needs you to desperately do well in the next election. I'll be voting One Nation. Well, Kat, we've had some really good polling in the last couple of weeks since I've come on board, which has been very personally satisfying. But it's not, it's been it hasn't been my work. It's been some great work of the team led by Pauline, and she's got a great team behind her. People are trying every single day to push that, and we are on the cusp. We are that close to be able to getting at least be challenging in several areas in the House of Representatives, and to get a senator up in every state. So we need in that next Senate. Imagine if we've got another 5 new senators in there to support Malcolm and Pauline in that Senate. How wonderful that would be at holding both the Labor and Liberal Party to account. That's the challenge that we've got ahead with us. That's what we need our supporters out there to be fired up, to be out there on the ground, to be talking to everyone they possibly can, and try and get as much support as we can and try and push that vote for One Nation as high as we can. We only need, as I said, the way the polls are going, we only just need a little bit more kick on, and we are right in there challenging for all those, every single Senate seat, one Senate seat in the nation. So just don't forget, before I coming up to the hour, the rallies on Sunday, most important. Sunday, 5th of May. Check on the One Nation website for where the location is. We know in Brisbane it's at the King George's Square, headed by Malcolm Roberts, and so we've got a couple of thousand people already confirmed to turn up there in Brisbane. So that's going to be a huge rally. Sydney, well, it's going to be a wet old weekend, but I said rain, hail or shine, that rally will be going ahead in Sydney. And we've got in the historical place of free speech called Speaker's Corner, which is exactly opposite the art gallery up there in the Domain. It's a great spot to have it. Traditional home of free speech. It was that Speaker's Corner has been there. Okay, who's going to the question here from Andrew? Who's going to the Sydney Digital ID protest on Sunday? We've got some great speakers. I'll be there. We've got John Ruddick from the Libertarians from New South Wales will also be speaking. We've got a couple of surprise guests. We've got one surprise guest. I can probably say it now. Billboard Chris said if he's here, he's been down in Melbourne. Hopefully he'll be up in Sydney. And he said if he's in Sydney, he'll come along and be one of our guest speakers. Those that follow Billboard Chris on social media knows that the great work that he's done. So look, there'll be a great list of speakers there on Sunday in Sydney. Hope to see you all there. 12 noon. I think that takes us up to the hour. So Malcolm, hope I didn't make too much of a mess of your hourly 3 p.m. live show, and I hope you'll have Malcolm with you back next week. So thanks everyone for listening in.